Okay, thank you very much. Thanks in particular to Marco, Fabrizio, and Agostino for organizing this fantastic symposium and for inviting me to join them. And thanks to Fausto as well for giving a good introduction about the general issues which are at stake here. My talk is going to be quite light on technical details. I'm just going to sketch out in general how I think we should think about the relationship between folk ontology and cognitive neuroscience, given these kinds of issues, and then maybe later on we can talk about some of the details and some particular cases. Yeah, so the basic aim of this talk is just, as I said, to investigate and to assess the relationship between what I'm calling folk ontology on the one hand, so folk ontology being our kind of common sense taxonomy of tasks and entities and so on, and what's actually going on in the brain, and in particular how we interpret neuroscientific evidence. So according to what I'm calling the classical view here, a kind of classical view of neuroscience, what we do is we come up with a task and we present the subject with the task and then see what happens in their brain, and we treat this as the correlational evidence for that task being performed by that region of the brain. This is the kind of straightforward way of doing it. And these tasks, I think, importantly, are drawn typically from our folk ontology. So we will think, we'll present somebody with some words and say this is a reading task, or we will present them with pictures of animals and say it's an animal identification task. So it's quite normal and quite natural for neuroscientists, who we need to not forget are also part of the folk, to use their own intuitive conceptions of what the mind might be and what the brain might be doing in order to structure and interpret these experiments. So this leads to issues when we look at the kinds of things which Fausto mentioned. So there seems to be not straightforward one-to-one mapping between these folk concepts and these folk-defined tasks and what's going on in the brain. And this, I will suggest, can lead us towards something like the eliminativist position endorsed previously by the Churchlands and by Steve Stitch. But then what I want to suggest is that if we abandon what I'm calling a literalist interpretation of what folk psychology is and what the folk ontology is, there is room to be both partially eliminativist for the purposes of neuroscience whilst retaining the folk ontology for everyday purposes. Okay, next slide. Fodor's still there. Fodor wasn't meant to be there anymore, but that doesn't matter. Fodor died last week or a few weeks ago, so we all need to be nice about him. Fodor, of course, didn't have much to say about neuroscience, but I think in a sense there is some connection between him and what I'm calling the classical view. So the idea here is that our folk ontology ought to be naturalizable in some sense by working out how it's implemented by the brain. So the idea here is that our common sense everyday understanding of how the mind works ought to correlate in a more or less one-to-one way with what's going on in the brain. And according to Fodor, if this isn't the case, or if we can't do this, it would be a disaster. And more generally, I think this is how neuroscientists have tended to think about what they're doing. We're trying to work out how our kind of common sense ideas of how the mind works are actually implemented in the brain. So this is represented here with a simple kind of diagram. So we've got various folk functions or folk ontological entities on the left here. So these might be everyday mental states like believing or desiring or like reading or like processing emotions of various kinds. And on the right here, we've got various neural structures. I should say here that I have a fairly broad interpretation of what folk psychology includes. So our kind of common sense taxonomies of the emotions are also going to be part of folk psychology. So the kind of work Fausto was talking about will also be part of this. So this is the classical view here. We want to find out where in the brain folk psychological states and processes are carried out, basically. Okay. So there are various threats to this. I won't describe any in any detail, but I think we can roughly break them down into two categories. So various issues to do with many-to-many mappings, or either one-to-many or many-to-one mappings. And then on the other hand, possibly a response to these issues, the idea of novel cognitive ontologies. So in the first instance, various kinds of many-to-many mappings occur, as Fausto mentioned, when we discover that what we thought was just one task is maybe being implemented in many different locations in the brain, or on the other hand, where one neural structure or one part of the brain is actually implemented in many different tasks. So you might, so I think as Marco has actually written about elsewhere, you might have first thought that Broca's area is just involved in linguistic processing because an impairment of it impairs linguistic processing, but it actually turns out that it is associated with many different kinds of tasks outside of linguistic processing. So we can't straightforwardly map one-to-one linguistic processing to Broca's area or some subset of linguistic processing. So this being the case, it becomes harder to carry out this classical program of one-to-one mapping between the folk ontology of the mind and the neural ontology or the neural structure of the brain. One kind of response to this has been to propose novel cognitive ontologies. So what you do is you come up with some kind of new terminology. So you say, rather than performing linguistic processing or rather than performing belief, say, this region is just doing something entirely new. So one suggestion for various parts of the brain has been that they're doing sensory motor integration. I guess we could see the constructivist program as similar to this. So rather than saying that the insula is involved in disgust, we say it's involved in core affect. This is a kind of construction of a novel ontology which is distinct from a folk ontology. So in a sense here, we end up doing away with the connection between the folk ontology and the neural structures and coming up with a new mapping to a new ontology. So this saves for one-to-one mapping, but perhaps at the expense of the folk ontology. So in the emotions, we have to get rid of what we think of intuitively as the basic set of the emotions in favor of some new ontology. Okay. So this brings us to the possibility of some kind of eliminativism with the very cute and cuddly Churchlands here. People, I find, are very hostile to the Churchlands in their project, so I like to include this picture to humanize them somewhat. I think it could be quite a reasonable project for reasons we'll see in a minute. So here, not only have you gotten rid of the one-to-one mappings between the folk ontology and the neural structures, but you take that lack of mapping as evidence that the folk ontology actually doesn't exist. So the fact that the folk ontology doesn't accurately seem to map onto what's going on in the brain is reason to discard it. It's just a failed ontology or a failed theory. That's more or less what the Churchlands were arguing for 30 years ago. So that's the kind of stage we reach just looking prima facie at the evidence, I think. But what is important to mention is that this push towards eliminativism rests on what I decided to call folk psychological literalism. So this is basically the idea that we should interpret folk psychology or the folk ontology as literally being about what's going on in the brain. And both the realists or the one-to-one mapping people and the eliminativists are going to be endorsing this idea of folk psychological literalism. So for both of these people, the starting premise is that folk psychology is aiming at accurately describing the brain. And this means if it fails to do so, we should get rid of it. So in this sense, both realism and eliminativism about folk psychology are just two sides of the same coin. They both endorse this same basic premise about what folk psychology is doing. And it's this, I think, which is mistaken, and this is how we can move away from a dichotomy to a more subtle position. Okay. Actually, so one thing to say there was a nice quote from your talk, Fausto, from, I can't remember the names of the people there now, but yeah, so it was in this to and fro between the constructivists and the essentialists. There was a quote from the essentialists talking about the paradoxical conclusion that there's no such thing as disgust, say, or whatever, which I think is what they were saying. And this seems to be essentially what they're calling the paradoxical conclusion here is what I'm calling the eliminativist position. So we can see the same kind of debate playing out there. Okay, so what happens if we reject literalism? So we say folk psychology isn't actually trying to accurately describe the brain, and it never was trying to describe the brain. So what we can do here is get rid of this dichotomy between realism and eliminativism, and this allows us to remain realists of sort about folk psychology, whilst getting rid of it from at least some areas of our scientific practice. So I would say that cognitive neuroscience is going to be one of these areas. So this leaves us room for our new ontology, which might come from various forms, and also our folk ontology at the same time. I should explain in a bit more detail how this is meant to work. Not yet. So the basic idea here, it's hard to see on this, but there's meant to be kind of a larger set of brackets there encompassing the neural structures. This is meant to include not only the neural structures, but also the whole body and the behavior it produces. So the idea here, which I've described in more detail elsewhere, is basically that it's a mistake to even think that folk psychology is trying to explain the kinds of fine-grained mechanisms and structures that we find in the brain and in neuroscience. And it's much more natural to think of folk psychology as being about the behavior of whole people, part of which is their brain. But it would be wrong to think that the entities in the folk ontology are to be found in the brain as such. They're just states of the whole person. So we can still say a person is disgusted, say, or that they believe something, but it's wrong to say that that disgust or that belief is localized at any one point in their brain. This isn't really a new idea, as we'll see later. Various people have similar ideas in the past, but I think it's important to bring it back onto the table, given these problems in mapping and in neurocognitive ontology. So there's, my view, needs a catchy name. If anyone has any ideas for a name, you can let me know. But basically, the idea here is that we can, as I was saying, we can be realists about the folk psychological ontology without committing to it literally describing neural structures. So we just need to back off from the idea that it's about the brain, basically. So there isn't going to be any kind of mind-brain identity or reduction in the classical sense. The kind of mentalistic language involved in folk psychology was just never meant to be doing that. Instead it describes something like the overall behavior of the system as a whole. And that behavior is going to be produced, at least in some sense, by the activity in the brain, but it's not identical with the brain. Okay. So then there are two kind of aspects to my view which come out here. One of them has been called in another context partial eliminativism by Edouard Machery. So in his work on concepts, Machery has advocated eliminating the concept of concepts from our cognitive scientific taxonomy, because he looks at the data and argues that really the kind concept isn't natural. There's no natural kind concept. In fact, there are different kinds of information-bearing structures in the brain or in cognitive systems, none of which directly maps onto our intuitive understanding of concepts. And in fact, our intuitive understanding of concepts is quite messy to begin with. So importantly, Machery doesn't advocate getting rid of the word concept, isn't going to go around rubbing it out of all the dictionaries or not telling anybody about the word concept. So in many cases, the word concept is still going to be useful. There's going to be an informal kind of folk sense in which we can talk about concepts. In fact, he has to, because he talks about the concept. It would be hard to write his book otherwise. But he thinks we shouldn't talk about concepts in psychology or in cognitive science, because there is no such thing. Instead, we need multiple, more fine-grained categories. And this, I would argue, is similar to the situation more broadly in cognitive neuroscience. So rather than just naively using concepts drawn from our folk ontology, we ought to come up with more fine-grained, or at least more accurate concepts which better reflect the actual structure of the brain and the actual structure of cognitive systems. So again, this isn't to say that we should get rid of those words or those concepts entirely, but that we shouldn't use them for kind of fine-grained purposes in cognitive neuroscience. So this already allows us to avoid one of the classical criticisms of the eliminativist project, which is just that it seems absurd to stop people using these terms to describe people and behavior and so on. And I don't think we should stop people doing anything. It's just that our actual scientific practice calls for a more fine-grained taxonomy. And this is really similar to how scientists have proceeded elsewhere. I think it's strange to think that the folk taxonomy should be very accurate when it comes to scientific purposes. So we don't think that we should stick to folk biological or folk chemical categories when we begin to investigate those domains. So similarly, whilst it's maybe a bit closer to home, I don't think there's any reason to stick to the folk taxonomies in cognitive science either. So we can be partial scientific eliminativists about folk concepts in cognitive science. So as I said, my positive view about folk psychology isn't really that new. It's very similar to Dennett's view, Dennett's intentional stance view, or various other views of this kind. It's going back pre-Dennett, it's very similar to Gilbert Ryle's view, that when you're going around asking which bit of the brain the mind is in, you're just making a category error. You're just missing the point. So So folk psychology, I would say, has never been about describing fine-grained mechanisms. It's about describing kind of macro-level structures and behaviors. So this lets us endorse what we might call Dennettian realism. It's very controversial to say that Dennett's a realist. People try to cast him as a fictionalist or an instrumentalist or even an eliminativist sometimes. But he is quite keen to call himself some kind of realist. He talks about real patterns, and I think we can think of the behavior, the kind of coarse-grained behavior of a person as a kind of real pattern. So there's no kind of fixed space-time point where their belief is, but their behavior as a whole has the belief type pattern or the discussed type pattern, say. So we can be Dennettian realists about folk psychological concepts whilst discarding them for fine-grained scientific purposes. Okay. So yeah, to conclude, literalism about the relationship between folk psychological functions and neural structures gives us this sharp dichotomy between realism on the one hand and eliminativism on the other. But we can discard this literalist interpretation of the folk ontology and move towards a more subtle position where we either eliminate or revise our use of folk concepts in cognitive neuroscience, but retain them for everyday purposes. However, this does mean giving up on the classical goal of naturalizing folk psychology. So we need to accept, I think, that folk psychology is basically a kind of social construct. It's a way we have of talking, maybe a kind of language game, but it's not something that's literally true about any particular part of a person, even if it's, in a sense, true about the whole person. I should also say that it's less clear how this relates to particular domains of cognitive science. So I think for neuroscience, it's quite clear that the folk concepts aren't much good. But if we move up the level into something like social psychology, perhaps that's a scientific domain where the folk concepts are useful and we should use them. So there's going to be some boundaries here where it's not quite clear whether or not folk concepts should be useful. But this really has to be an empirical question, I think. Whether or not any given folk concept accurately tracks something in the system is something we need to work out scientifically. Although, as Fausto pointed out, there are lots of problems with how we go about doing that. But at the very least, I think we shouldn't stick religiously to the folk ontology of a folk taxonomy, and we should be willing to discard it when it isn't helpful.